Good morning, good day, and good evening, everyone. We're, I think, pretty much all over the world for this webinar for World Tourism Day. One day early, but I believe that everyone on this call, on this webinar, would have already planned for amazing webinars and events for World Tourism Day proper. So we decided to do it one day early, and then we will share the recording of this webinar tomorrow on World Tourism Day. So without further ado, let's move forward with the webinar. So hello, everyone. My name's Thomas Ahmed. I'm the Global Manager, Projects and Partnerships at Planeterra. And it's my pleasure today to be this webinar's moderator and your host to explore this very important topic. And I'm sure you're aware of this important topic as you have decided to join this webinar. So welcome again. I'd like to first and foremost extend my thanks on behalf of the Planeterra team and of all of the panelists to all of you for joining this very special webinar dedicated to exploring the theme of this year's World Tourism Day, but from a very Planeterra perspective. This year, the UNWTO has picked the theme Rethinking Tourism. Now, that can mean many things for many people from many different perspectives, but today we've decided to take a community tourism perspective. The COVID pandemic, as we all have been aware, has been a time of reflection for many in the tourism sector. Pretty much stood still for a couple of years. And all of us tourism professionals have really had this opportunity to take a few steps back and rethink tourism. There's been a call recently to build back better and rethink how we do tourism and how, as tourism professionals from all over the world and from different perspectives, we can work together to, one, maximize the positive impacts of tourism and minimize the negative ones, make destinations better places to live in and better places to visit in that order. It's very important. And from Planeterra's point of view, put communities at the center of tourism development. So to mark World Tourism Day 2022, Planeterra has chosen to explore a complex yet oh so important topic, which is community tourism and protected areas. So today, we will engage with our distinguished panel to explore how we can rethink community tourism in the context of protected areas and in a post-COVID world. So this topic was chosen as we are currently in the final stages of implementing a project in partnership with the IUCN and funded by GIZ in Peru and Vietnam. The project is called Sustainable Tourism and Protected Areas in a Post-COVID World, and I'll share more information on that project later on in the webinar. Two of our panelists, Richard and Phuong, are the field officers and managing these projects in Peru and Vietnam currently, and they will give us some perspectives from their experience in the field. But one thing is for certain, communities are key to the success and sustainability of protected areas. They are the custodians of the land and the stewards of nature. In many cases, generations have engaged and lived with the animals, plants, and landscapes that now find themselves in these protected areas. The pressures of globalization and a demand-driven society, along with a need to satisfy basic needs like putting food on the table or sending children to school, have put pressure on communities to harvest resources in a way that has upset the balance of human-wildlife harmony and which so often turns into human-wildlife conflict, perpetuating, for example, the spread of diseases, which, as we have all experienced over the past couple of years, can affect the entire globe. And today we're talking about tourism. Now, tourism can be part of the toolkit, and it's important not to consider it as a panacea, but it's a part of a wide variety of tools that can be used to uplift communities and provide alternative livelihood opportunities so that communities can thrive alongside and potentially with nature. And we'll be exploring this from different perspectives today. So without further ado, I would like to present the panelists. So first of all, I'd like to introduce Jim Sano. Jim is World Wildlife Fund's Vice President for Travel, Tourism and Conservation. He directs WWF's community-based conservation travel programs, serves as the technical lead for WWF's partnerships with private sector travel companies, and oversees the organization's educational trips for its most committed members and supporters. And he's also the recipient of 5 National Park Service Special Achievement Awards in the US. So welcome, Jim. Next, we have Jacob Terveen. Jacob is the co-founder of Association Zara and co-owner of the ITC Eco Lodge in Ranohira in Madagascar. In 2016, after having read a UN report about the drought situation and the impacts of deforestation and global warming in his region, he and his wife decided to create Association Zara and try to slow down the negative impact by reforesting, protecting the environment and biodiversity, and at the same time, try to find, offer and promote eco-friendly and social solutions. As a hotel owner, Jacob and his wife had tried to convince and work with tour operators, individual tourists, and other associations abroad to take part in the association's social as well as ecological activities and leave a positive impact on the region instead of only leaving footprints. As a tourist, he's also visited countries on all continents and as an expat, lived in several different countries. So welcome, Jacob. Next, we have Shivya Nath. Shivya is an author and award-winning travel blogger of the blog The Shooting Star. Her work focuses on sustainable and experiential travel, and she has contributed stories to some of the world's leading travel publications like BBC Travel and Travel and Leisure. She has been featured by the Washington Post among travelers changing the way we think about the world, and by National Geographic Traveler among travelers of color smashing stereotypes. She recently founded Climate Conscious Travel, which works with destinations, businesses, and nonprofits to develop climate conscious experiences, sustainable accommodations, and community-led initiatives. So welcome, Shivya. Next on the panel, we're going to some Planeterra employees who are working on the IUCN project that I talked about earlier. So we have Phuong Tran. Phuong leads Planeterra's work in Vietnam related to a GIZ-funded tourism project, ensuring the project's goals are successfully delivered and communities in protected areas can begin to restore benefits from tourism after the devastating impacts of COVID-19. Phuong has cultivated her passion to work with communities since the early days of her career, when she worked in a remote mountainous area of Vietnam for an international NGO. Later on, despite moving to the for-profit sector, but with a purpose, her passion grew even stronger. Her work spectrum focuses on sustainability and sustainable development, of which community development is an integral part. Over the years, she has sharpened her expertise in the facilitation of public-private partnerships, social impact assessment, so framework establishment and monitoring and evaluation, market research and analysis, and community engagement, as well as working on sustainable private sector development. And currently, I'm in Vietnam with Phuong, and we've been having an amazing experience looking at the different communities that we've been working with on this project. So welcome, Phuong, to the webinar. And finally, last but not least, Richard Bazan. Richard is Planeterra's community tourism project manager in Peru. So Peru is another country in which we are implementing the IUCN Sustainable Tourism and Protected Areas in a Post-COVID World project. Richard is a specialist in tourism management, development, and marketing of tourist destinations and products. Over 10 years of experience in the design and implementation of models, strategies, methodologies, and tools for the sustainable development of community-based tourism products in the public, private, and non-governmental sector. He has managed international projects with an impact on innovation and sustainability in tourism. So welcome, Richard, to the panel. So now I've introduced the panelists. I think we can go straight into the discussing what Planeterra does, who we are, and what we do. So Planeterra is a non-profit NGO based in Canada, but we are also based heavily around the world, field-based. We have program managers in Zambia, that's Evie. We have Sophia in Cambodia and Joel in the Americas, in Peru. And our mission is to promote and support community enterprise development, community tourism enterprise development across the planet. For 20 years now, we've been working on community tourism enterprise development, and we have been working on creating market-driven opportunities for communities by providing them with the business skills and the market access opportunities and the product development skills and knowledge in order to be able to create some products, some tourism products that respond to an ever-increasing demand for more authentic and more impactful tourism experiences. Moving on from that, we've also, during the COVID times, during the COVID period, as it were, we've been working heavily on developing the Global Community Tourism Network. So the Global Community Tourism Network was developed as a need to a problem. And the problem was that during COVID times, when tourism stood still, we realized and we noticed that a lot of communities were losing livelihoods, and we thought that this would be an opportunity to create a network of community enterprises who could not only learn new skills and knowledge to prepare them for when COVID ended, but also that could network between themselves in order to be able to share the knowledge and the skills necessary from different perspectives in order to overcome the challenges, the everyday challenges that communities face when developing their businesses. And we realized that and thanks to COVID, as it were, that community enterprises and the skills and knowledge that they needed could not only apply to the tourism sector, but could also apply to developing other businesses that can provide alternative livelihoods and additional livelihoods to enable them to reach their potential. So the GCTN, in a nutshell, supports community tourism enterprises to achieve their unique skills and abilities. The main activities the GCTN includes are access to online learning, connection and networking, and partnership and promotion. So this is what we're all here for, is the questions to ask our distinguished guests about their experiences in travel and tourism and community tourism. So I'll start with Jim. Jim, through your experience in travel, tourism, and conservation, what is the biggest problem you are seeing in the tourism industry with regard to the people who live in and around protected areas? And how are you, through your work, solving these problems?
Morning. The biggest challenge is looking at how travel and tourism benefits local communities and the supply or the value chain associated with tourism in and around protected areas. It is something that is oftentimes people just focus on the direct benefits, but we also think it's important to look at the indirect benefits. One of the most comprehensive studies that has recently come out was by one of our research scientists, Robin Naidu, and he looked at 600 protected areas in 34 different countries. And what he found that exists today is there are 17% higher wealth levels, 16% lower likelihood of poverty, 10% of height to weight ratios, which indicator of health. So first of all, protected areas do benefit local livelihoods. But second of all, what is oftentimes missing in many destinations is a holistic destination management planning process for not only existing destinations, but also for new destinations in the future. And this is combining both the science-based knowledge on all different channels, the socio-economic landscape, and also the governance and the finance of those areas. So it's a blend of those three, and there is a three-track planning process or management process that we'll provide the links to, and it is in varying degrees oftentimes present, but it is worthy of looking at this process to look at your destinations and ultimately determine how to best manage those areas.
Thanks, Jim. No, very, very interesting point of view on that. And I guess there's a lot of tools and a lot of information out there, but it's difficult to get that to the people who are affected the most by the decisions around protected areas, such as the communities.
Right, and that's why the stakeholder engagement throughout the planning process is vital, because it's both an educational tool, but it addresses the whole social inclusion challenge, which is oftentimes what you see missing in many destinations, because it's not only all the stakeholders include not only the government, but also the private sector, but most importantly, the communities and what they ultimately would like, which is not always the same in many destinations.
No, definitely. Thank you very much for your answer. Okay, so next question is for Jacob. So living and working with a community in a protected area, what has been your experience when positively impactful tourism is introduced into the community? Jacob, maybe you're on mute?
I'm sorry. Yes, in many developing countries, the political will and the financial possibilities to develop, especially the rural areas, are quite limited. In our own community, it's especially the political will that is missing. What positive tourism shows the local population who wants to develop, who wants to go forward, is that they do not need to depend on local politicians by simply getting tourists involved, tour operators involved in either sponsoring or even participating in their projects. As soon as you have a good project and you're able to speak to tour operators or tourists and convince them that is something needed and will further develop the community and population. If you can get them on board, no more need for obstructing politicians. That's often the case in developing countries.
Thank you very much, Jacob. Yeah, definitely. That's as I mentioned at the beginning, it's quite a complex situation to deal with the political side of things, the private sector side of things, the needs of the communities. And it's always interesting and essential to get communities on board from the start and actually make it a community-centric decision-making process. Because ultimately the impacts of tourism are going to be most felt within the communities who live in and around protected areas.
Yeah, absolutely.
So thank you very much for your answer, Jacob. Very, very insightful. Okay, so next we're going to go on to Shivya. So Shivya, you've got a vast experience of telling stories about community tourism. Do you have any experiences that show the plights of communities who are often left behind in the tourism that happens in protected areas they live in and around?
Yeah, so I think there are examples around the world of that. I think just recently there's news of how thousands of Maasai people are being evicted from their ancestral lands in Tanzania in order to build a wildlife game reserve for trophy hunting and for safaris. And the situation's not looking great at all. But on the other hand, we have Hawaii, where for decades tourism has been centered around the traveler and has ignored the indigenous people. But for the first time, amends are being made to change what tourism looks like in Hawaii. But to be honest, I don't have to go that far to look for examples. I think in my own backyard in the Indian Himalayas, I spent time many years ago in a protected wildlife sanctuary, which is called Binsar. So it has these beautiful old growth oak, rhododendron, deodar forests. And of course, travelers who love nature love this area. But there was one very human memory while I was in Binsar that I wanted to share today, just to kind of humanize some of the statistics that Jim was sharing earlier. So I hiked down to one of the villages, which is part of the buffer zone in Binsar, and there are about 15, 16 villages there. And people have traditionally lived in this forest for centuries. They've protected it, whether that was for their sustenance or for their religious or spiritual reasons. And many village communities, still live there and call this place home. So I hiked to one of these villages, and it was a beautiful place, surrounded by the forest. And there were about 15, 20 households. But it was very bizarre because I couldn't see a single person around for the entire time that I was walking there. And then I noticed that some of the houses were in disrepair, some were just locked up, and there were traces of agriculture, but not much. And then I finally spotted this really elderly woman, maybe 60, 70 years old, and she was just looking out of her window. So I went to ask her, where is everybody? And she just said in a very matter-of-fact way, "Sab chale gaye," which basically means everyone left the village. And then we got chatting, and I learned that in the buffer zone of Binsar, there was a legislation that was passed a few years ago, which no longer allowed people to have access to the traditional forest resources. And this is a village that was about a 4 to 5 hour trek from the main road. So for anyone to access the market for everyday products, or even access like a school or a hospital, people had to walk that distance in order to make their lives work. And so as a result, most people decided to leave the village and abandon their community, their culture, their households, and move to different parts to look for work. But this woman, for some reason, refused to leave. And she said she loved the forest and this was her home, and nobody was going to evict her from her home. And she invited me in for a cup of tea, and we had a long chat. And when I was about to leave, she gave me an awkward hug, and there were tears in her eyes. And I think it was this sense of loneliness and sense of loss of a whole community that kind of led me on this path that I'm today, where we have to be very careful when there are protected areas, but the community is not part of that protection. We ignore the very people who have lived there for centuries and who have been custodians of these natural resources. But it's very easy not easy, but it is possible to reimagine tourism in these areas such that the communities benefit from it, and they naturally become, custodians of managing these forests and these resources sustainably.
Yeah, and I think that story is reflected across the world in many, many, many communities. Having worked around protected areas on community tourism projects for a number of years now, this is repeated again and again and again. And actually, I would say that protected area management for it to be successful and sustainable, needs to rely on these community champions, the people who are really attached to the land, who are attached to the heritage, who have a sense of belonging, and who have these even spiritual attachments to forests and other landscapes, and to ignore these people and to ignore the skills and the knowledge that they have already to protect these areas is just really just shooting conservation activities in the foot, as it were. So, no, very, very important points to consider. So thank you very much, Shivya, for this. So before I move on to a question to Richard and Phuong, I just want to present a little bit more about the project that we're working on in Peru and Vietnam, as they will give you some field-based insights on the work that they've been implementing there. So we've been working for the past year in Peru and in Vietnam. So in Peru, we've been working with communities around Rio Abiseo National Park and Amaracari Communal Reserve. And in Vietnam, we've been working with Cuc Phuong National Park and Van Long Nature Reserve. And all of these different reserves are important because of the biodiversity that they're in there, but also because of the potential for these protected areas to be more community run and community led and community managed, or at least that communities have a lot more decision-making powers in regard to how the protected areas are managed. And they've been considered or are already considered as green list protected areas by the IUCN. And so we have partnered with the IUCN on developing a project and implementing a project called Sustainable Tourism and Protected Areas in a Post-COVID World. And the project aims to develop a more crisis-resilient and sustainable tourism landscape, and in the spirit of building back better for the people, wildlife, and ecosystems, improve the ecological and social aspects of tourism in and around protected areas and conserved areas. And using the vast knowledge and the experience that Planeterra has, we've been working with selected communities to build skills, to share knowledge, and to develop businesses, and to provide market access opportunities to show that there is a sound model for working with communities, and that communities play a fundamental role in not only protecting protected areas and conserving the wildlife within, but also provides an opportunity for local economic development, and for people to be able to reach their potential as human beings. So let me then go on and ask a question to Richard about the project in Peru. So Richard, we know that there are still a few months left to complete this project, but what learnings can you share from your experience working with the communities at the Amaracari Communal Reserve and Rio Abiseo National Park? And what have been the biggest challenges for you?
Sure. Hello, everyone who's attending this meeting. I think there's several layers on the learnings that we have with the field officers in both of the destinations we work in Peru. One of the things that is a cross learning for both of us, for the whole team, is about the field approach that we have. Not only by the work we do with the communities, but also with the people we work with, and transferring the knowledge and the outcomes that we expect to have for the project with these two young people, young women. One of them is representative out of one of the indigenous community, which is something that teaches a lot as management, but at the same time, put a trust environment for the people working with Planeterra that they didn't know before, that they don't have, they haven't been in contact to before. And that is something that put us in a way that we needed to get their trust in the very beginning. So having field officers with them has been really important, not only to transfer the goals, but also to empower communities and the people. And the other thing about learning is this cross communications that we had with different stakeholders, but not only about the product design, which is something really important, and I think I can talk about that later, but also sharing with all the stakeholders. I agree with Jim. It is important to see not only the impacts, because you don't see the impacts in the short term. We talk about the effects and the importance and the effects that this product has in different contexts of destination. So having this cross communication with them, not only about the product, but also about the effects that can pursue different impacts, and also the sustained process that we want to live after these projects was also important, because identifying the role, identifying and sharing the same vision that Planeterra and IUCN Sur has for this project in terms of sharing with different stakeholders. Some different stakeholders can have a different idea or different vision about the goals the community wants to achieve with the product. So that was something that we learned during this process. And as a big challenge, we see still, not only for this project, I guess for different ones, is the cross view of community tourism, not only as part of a complementary product in the destination, but as a main part in this we call a human development that includes communities as the main part of the main core of a destination management. And it's something important that invites us to rethink about the sustainability models that we have today. It is not only economy, it is not only environment, it is putting the people in the middle. And by empowering the people in the middle, we can achieve more responsible economy process or more responsible environmental process through tourism. And that is what I think. It is not only a challenge for this project, but to different initiatives that nowadays is going again more commonly in our world. That would be mine.
Thank you very much, Richard. No, definitely. And having had the opportunity to work with Richard and his team over the last few months on this project, having community members as part of the implementation team has been really, really key in us working from a community perspective on developing products, on training enterprises, and on creating an environment where trust can be built. Because one thing that people forget is that trust and purpose are a huge factor in getting projects off the ground and running. And that is fundamental for any project developing tourism with community. So thank you, Richard, for your insight on that. Very useful. Okay, so next question, with the IUCN project in mind still, I'd like to ask Phuong. So Phuong, what do you think should be the role of protected area management, tourism stakeholders and policymakers in making sure that tourism is open and inclusive to the local people around them?
Thank you, Thomas, for the question. As a person who works from the ground with local communities side by side, I think in order to answer that question, I would like to break it down to two parts, two layers, I would say. The first layer would be the question of why should tourism be open and inclusive to local people. Of course, as all the previous panelists have pointed out, and I think all of us would agree, because the local people are the center of the conservation work. And it's not hard for us to answer this question. But I'm asking this from the local community's point of view, many people that I work with who are from the local communities don't even know their importance in the conservation of nature and cultural heritage. They don't even know that tourism can be open and inclusive, and they themselves can take an active role in tourism. So it is very important for me that the protected areas management, tourism stakeholders, and policymakers can take different measures to admit and reaffirm this, and especially to make the local communities themselves to understand this. And the second layer of this would be, once the local communities have has the understanding like how important they are in the tourism development, then the next step would be for the protected area management and policy makers and other stakeholders to come together and act as catalysts to create an enabling environment for the local communities to thrive and to basically start tourism initiative. And once they have that kind of motivation to go on and understand that they are not just the beneficiaries of all the projects that have been implemented, but also they can be a very effective working force in conservation, that's when they would take the action and take the lead in going forward. How to create this enabling environment, I think that would be for a whole another discussion. But yeah, so that's just for a very short amount of time. This within the time frame of this discussion, I would say those are the most two important things to keep in mind.
No, absolutely. Thank you so much, Phuong, for that insight. And I think maybe there might be a webinar that we could create around this topic of how to create an enabling environment for community tourism around protected areas. So watch this space. So before we move on to the next questions for the panelists, so we'll be sharing the link to project information that is on the Planeterra website, and maybe Evie can share that in the chat screen so that the participants can maybe visit the site and learn a little bit more about our project afterwards. And of course, don't forget that at the end of this webinar, there'll be some time for questions from the participants. So feel free to write your questions in the chat box, and Selena and Evie will pull them out and read a few of those so that the panelists can answer and give some insights. Okay, so very interesting discussion up until now, I think you'll agree, but also a very complex issue, a very complex topic from different perspectives. Right, so I'll move forward. So Jim, I have a question for you now. So often local people feel like they're on the outside looking in when it comes to protected area tourism. Through your work, do you have any examples of successful practices that businesses in the travel industry can follow when working in and around protected areas that include and directly benefit local people?
One of our signature programs is in Namibia, which has started in the 1990s, and it was transformative in that essentially no wildlife was poached to on the brink of extinction. And so the new government of Namibia hardwired the environment and conservation and tourism into their constitution. And so at this point in time, with involvement with the community, and actually the community owning the wildlife, this very successful system was created so that the wildlife recovery was extraordinary. We have other examples in places like Nepal around Chitwan National Park, where there is this partnership between communities and government, NGOs, multilateral financial institutions. And that has also worked spectacularly, one at the high end of the tourism market, the other at more the affordable end of the tourism spectrum. And so one thing I might point people to is participants to is actually WWF's Protected Area Planning and Social Safeguards Framework. This was created a couple of years ago, which kind of captures how to integrate communities into the process. The other thing is to look at, as was mentioned before, the enabling conditions that really kind of take into, in a holistic perspective, is community-based tourism appropriate for an area? It isn't, one of the stark realities is while communities might have this aspirational goal to benefit from tourism, not all destinations are marketable. So it looks at all of these elements of enabling conditions, private sector partners being a critical one because they're the marketing and sales arm to ultimately attract and bring tourists to those areas.
Thanks, Jim. Yeah, no, the point you made, well, those 2 points you made, one about government involvement and having champions within government can play a huge part in implementing a community-focused strategy when it comes to tourism development. And you've seen that around the world, those countries who put conservation and community tourism as a priority for government policy are leaders in developing products and services that integrate communities within the tourism supply chain. And the other point you made, which is very key, about the community involvement in these activities, in these tourism development activities, but also asking the question, is it really viable? And actually, do the communities want tourism in their areas? Do they want to benefit from tourism or other activities, or maybe no activities that they'd like to develop? So it's very, very important to consider those questions when moving forward. Okay, thanks so much. So I'm moving on to Shivya now. Shivya, I know that you've worked on providing some storytelling workshops to our Global Community Tourism Network members. So my question to you is going to be about social media and storytelling. Do you believe social media and storytelling are the missing piece when it comes to tourism in protected areas? And I've got a second question for you in the same light, which is, can travelers through social media and sharing their stories of travel be a force for positivity when it comes to making sure that people who live in and around protected areas are benefiting from tourism?
Yeah. So I think to answer your first question, storytelling it's not the only missing piece, but it's definitely an important one. I feel like we've kind of centered the traveler in the tourism experience. And in the same line, we've centered the traveler's voice in the storytelling experience. So what happens is we often only hear an outsider's perspective, a visitor's perspective of a place, its culture, its food, its resources. And as a travel writer, for instance, I go into different communities and I bring their stories, whether that's to the digital world or the print world. But what about their own voices, right? So I think this realization really hit home during the pandemic. Because of the tourism shutdown, as a travel writer, I suddenly lost all my sources of income. But because I had access to the digital world, I could pivot to find other opportunities. But I realized that wasn't true of my friends in, say, rural India or in many rural communities around the world, like guides, homestay hosts, anyone directly or indirectly associated with tourism. And at least in India, even though many people have access to the internet, they have access to smartphones, they don't have access to the kind of digital skills and opportunities they should by now, especially for ones who are associated with tourism. So that's when I joined forces with Malika Virdi, who is a sarpanch in a mountain village in India. and Osama Manzar, who is the founder of the Digital Empowerment Foundation. And we started a platform called Voices of Rural India, which is essentially a platform where we create space for the voices of communities that have, I guess, either been deliberately silenced or just been unheard, over the years. I hate using the term voiceless because they definitely have a voice. So what we did was we partnered with community tourism organizations across India to create a space where people can share their own stories, whether they are to do with how they are being impacted by climate change or how tourism has impacted the community and so forth. And we conducted training sessions to enable them to tell these stories through photography, through video, through writing, and so forth. And storytelling is an integral part of most culture. So our intervention was really to do it, to enable them to do it digitally. And at the same time, it was a source of alternate livelihoods for them because a lot of people lost their income during the pandemic and during the tourism shutdown. So our storytellers included people like craftspeople, natural medicine practitioners, musicians, farmers. Many of them were women, many of them were younger people, but also older people. And I think absolutely as travelers and as storytellers, we have this responsibility to create space for the voices of the communities that we are traveling to meet. And, we are going to their land, we are going to their resources, we are leveraging their resources. So it is definitely a responsibility and a missing piece in the whole, bringing communities to the forefront of tourism in these areas.
Thank you. And I'm going to add another question, and I know you might not have prepared for this, but we're talking about responsibility in storytelling. And I think that there is such a thing as responsible storytelling. I don't know whether you could give us a little bit of your thoughts and your understanding of what makes up responsible storytelling.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think even before we can talk about responsible storytelling in travel, we need to ensure that the storytellers themselves are traveling responsibly. So I think it's kind of like two layers to the same thing. Because if you are, if you are seeking experiences which aren't necessarily supporting communities or conservation, then are you able to tell their stories in a responsible way? So I think that's the first question. And then the second thing is, I think to me, responsible storytelling is kind of looking at what impact the story is going to have and on who. So is your story going to impact travelers? But is it also going to impact the places and the communities that you are writing about? And are you able to tell that story in a way that brings community voices to the forefront, whether that's working collaboratively with them to publish the story, or at least bringing forth their voices in the story in a very realistic way? So I think there are many different elements and layers to it, but it's definitely a very important question.
Good. Thank you so much, Shivya. Great. Thanks. So moving forward, and I'm quite enjoying this webinar. It's bringing up some really great topics of discussion. So Jacob, I have a question for you. So clearly, tourism and protection of places, animals, and people have to go hand in hand. As a member of a community that has seen the benefits of tourism, that includes everyone, what do you think the travel industry needs to change in order to benefit more communities like yours?
I think in general, they need to be much more aware of where they're going and where they take the tourists to in their programs. We are living in a very dry area, and we often see that the tourists that are coming here with tour operators do not actually realize where they are and what the problems are, whether they are economical, environmental, or social problems. For instance, in general, when tourists travel, they want to go stay in hotels with swimming pools, etc. When you live in a very dry area, in a desert area, having a swimming pool is not a very good idea for a hotel if the population of the village where it is situated doesn't even have drinking water. Yeah, and these are problems that often travel agencies, tour operators are not aware of. At the same time, they're trying to do good for their customers, for the tourists. But I think they should educate better the tourists that are traveling with them on where they are going. At the same time, some travel agencies, or individual tourists, they have this idea about helping the local population, but in a non-organized manner. I always tell people when they travel and they want to do something, they want to give handouts to pass it on to a local organization, a local association, because by even doing something good, you may create social problems. For instance, here in our village, children get out of school around 5 o'clock. Around 4 o'clock, the buses with tourists are coming in. Now, everybody is aware that giving out candy to children is a bad idea. Often they don't have the money, or even have never been taught to brush their teeth, etc. Yeah, so handing out candy, everybody understands, not a good idea. But they start like handing out pens to take them to school, so they have a pen to write on. That seems a good idea. But what people do not realize is that children are dropping out of school, skipping classes, just to be there at 4 o'clock, to get pens and get as many as possible, which are then being sold on to other people. They're not going to use them in their class. At the same time, with the clothes handouts, not necessarily the people who are next to the bus or next to you are the persons that are in most need of free handouts. In general, they're the loudest or the strongest people who have become the first in line. Therefore, it's always better to contact a local organization, and do this in a structured manner. So in general, I'd say travel agencies should be more aware of the situation in the area before they even start coming, because what I see from experience, many organizations are creating, whether it be big or minor problems, but problems are there.
No, absolutely. And thank you so much for that insight, and hoping that there are travel agencies on the webinar today who can take some of that information from you. No, it's and you see this time and time again around the world. The same practices are felt, and not many people are taking note of the impacts that some of these well-meaning but not very responsible practices are having. So I think you're right, educating the travel industry that and the travelers, that even the smallest thing that you think may be benefiting, you need to take a step back and see what the consequences of that is, and the responsibility. And actually the thing to think about is the impact. How can you maximize your positive impacts and what those impacts are, and how can you minimize your negative impacts on the social, economic and environmental makeup of the destination. So thanks so much for that insight, Jacob. Okay, great. Before I move on to the next question for the next panelist, I just want to remind participants that you can post your questions in the chat box that we would like to share with our panelists to give their insights. Don't be shy. Feel free to ask any question, and we'll do our best to share these with the panelists. Okay, great. So moving forward with Richard. So Richard, you've been in the field providing much needed in-person training to community members in Rio Abiseu and Amaracari protected areas. From your perspective, what are the community's feelings towards being more engaged in tourism?
Well, it's interesting to have a question about feelings, which reminds us about the vision and the way that people understand tourism and the expectations that they have about tourism. And I think Rethinking Tourism involves actually the understanding or including the complexion that communities have in a different context and different conditions. For the managers of the project, the field officers of the project, it is a challenge not to understand the complications, because it's not about a complication, it's about a complexity. It's about many things going around the communities, and that implies that there is no a standard formula to get into one community and to build the product. So my first answer will be about the feelings is about understanding the complexities that this has for the people. And also when it comes to a product building, a product design, which is the main core value of Planeterra with communities, one of the main core values, it is also about departing from what they know best and not trying to force a different way of saying what they know, what they do in the protected areas. And that is something really important in the feelings that they have as well, because empowerment to me and to my team means taking the best of what they know and trying to understand that complexity and to build a product based on those variables. And that is what we did with all the 10 communities that we have in the project. Some people work in cocoa field and harvesting and exploitation. Some other difference work with protecting the protected area itself and monitoring, having different type of training with different stakeholders. The key challenge was to identify those assets in person and as a collective team. And regarding to that, one of the things that align our presence and the feelings and the expectations that they have was also building bridges with those assets that people have in their communities, and now with tourism to the stakeholders. And that implies also for us, that implied that tourism is not an outside detail that the people can come back when they have the need to, or the main activity, economic activity in the community. It is about in the middle. It's a complementary activity, but nonetheless, it's a complementary. It means that they have big challenges to organize themselves, to identify the leader, communication with their own leader, and that is some, let's say, feelings or dialogues on this trends that we identify in the community. Also to be aware of the trainings that we did and the way that we train the people, and being very careful about those social and grammar dialogues that we had into account for that. And last but not least, one good feeling about the project in all these 10 communities was about the cash for work and the action plan mechanism, which are not a usual scheme of working about infrastructure and facilities the community did, because many of the times the work wages that people put into the work are free, or it's about the things that they have to put in counterparties to accomplish that activity. But this mechanism was designed, and its model is based in, we identified a need that comply with the needs of the tourists and the needs of the communities. We develop a scheme in which they can work for building those infrastructure, and at the same time they're earning incomes from that building for putting their works and their time in their incomes. And that opened a lot. I'm in the middle of a field trip now, and the responses and the feelings that people are providing to us are really motivational, really encouraging, because they're really, really happy of the results. And as I mentioned before, it's not a formula that we came, a defined formula before. It is something that we presented and we start to open in discussions with community, and they feel that the things that they're presenting now, the houses, the stairs, and the bridges, is something that they wanted before. And with tourism, they're complying with that. And the vision that they have of tourism now, based on those infrastructures and facilities, is, to my mind, very empowering for every community that show their testimonies with us.
Great. Thank you, Richard. And I think you touched on a very important point, which is that there is no formula. You can go through basic activities, but it's always going to change depending on the context, depending on the individuals that you're working with, depending on the worldviews that you're working with. And also, I think it's important to point out that community tourism, enterprise development, or community tourism development around protected areas takes time. And it takes a lot of time to build the trust, to build an understanding of different perspectives, in order to be able to tailor make the activities and the knowledge and the skills that are shared, so that the project can be successful and sustainable. And there are many, many projects around the world that have tried to implement activities very quickly to short time frames, and have not succeeded. And you see that there is a reoccurring instance of spending a bit more time and doing a bit more groundwork and building a little bit more on those foundations can have a dramatic effect when trust and purpose is developed between the communities that are part of the project, and the people or organizations that are facilitating the development of community tourism around protected areas. So thank you very much for that insight, Richard. Okay, so I have a question for everyone on the panel, and before I move on to that question for everyone, I am going to just remind participants once again that if there are any questions that you would like to ask the panelists, feel free to share those within the chat box. We will also share all the resources that have been mentioned during this webinar within the chat box. And don't forget that we will also be sharing the link to the recording on social media, and also via all of our social media platforms, so that you can feel free to share those within your own networks and spread the word about this webinar. So thanks a lot for your attention up until now. Okay, so moving forward, a question for all. I'm going to go back to Jim, and then we'll go through all of the panelists. So Jim, in your opinion, what needs to change in tourism to protect people and the environment, especially those who are living in areas that require protection or need significant protection?
Well, I go again back to the destination management planning process. And it not only involves tourism, but also looking at it again holistically on how are ways to approach the solutions that also take into account social inclusion, biodiversity, climate, waste, governance, as was mentioned before, and the quality of the traveler experience. So in terms of changing, first of all, just being invited to the table for stakeholders and communities is huge. And then continuing throughout the process to look as the plans develop, to be invited again to workshops when the drafting is at various drafting phases, and then ultimately looking at the final management plans. As was mentioned before, the state of Hawaii just went through a process. I would encourage people to look at their website under Hawaii Tourism Authority and the destination planning process or action plans. it goes through kind of a step-by-step process, which is a really good resource or a template to look at to include communities.
Thank you very much, Jim. Excellent. So I'm going to go round the panelists. So Shivya, you're next. I'll just ask the question again. In your opinion, what needs to change in tourism to protect people and the environment, especially for those who are living in areas that require significant protection?
I think Jim said it really eloquently that we need to invite communities to the table, which is something that's not happening in many destinations right now. But I think we also need to go back a little bit more to even rethinking, which is a great theme for World Tourism Day this year, which is rethinking what tourism itself means. Because for the longest time, tourism has been relative to the experience of the traveler. And I think what Jacob said as well, it's not just about the traveler, it's also about the places and the people who invite the traveler. And so I think we need to kind of flip that narrative and say, how does that tourism experience impact the community and the environment that they call home? So I think once we have like a different worldview where we're not just thinking of the traveler's experience, but also the experience of the people who live there and the resources that they rely on, then I think the kind of policies, the kind of destination management, storytelling, and even the experience of the traveler will be very different. And like people and the planet won't be, just an afterthought, but a very core part of the tourism design. So I think we need to go back to the very foundation of what tourism is and how we've defined it over the years.
No, thank you very much, Shivya. That's very important to consider the guest-host relationship and to realize that tourism isn't only for the tourist, but it also should be from the perspective of the community and what the communities can gain from tourism. And in an ideal world, tourism should be equitable and everyone should have the opportunity to experience a tourism product and experience, whether you're living in Zambia or in the UK or in Brazil, anywhere around the world. But we're not there yet as a society, as a global society, to enable that to happen. But hopefully one day. Great. Thank you so much, Shivya, for your input on that question. For the next panelist, for Jacob, I'm going to ask that question again. Jacob, from your perspective and your experience, what do you think needs to change in tourism to protect people and the environment, especially for those who are living in areas that require significant protection?
Yeah, then I come back actually to my awareness issue with the tourist industry about the problems of the region that they're visiting, and especially the contact with the local population or organizations that are involved in development on a local scale. So they understand what problems are. You need to understand the problem before you can solve it. Yeah, and so the awareness is a very important thing. And then communicating with the local organizations on what can be done to solve the problem. Personally, I'm convinced that every tour operator wants to continue to visit the sites that they are visiting. And for them to see a site deteriorating, whether it be by drought, as in our case, or vandalism, graffiti, which makes it less attractive for tourism. Yeah, I'm convinced that every tour operator wants to keep these sites that they're selling in their package. Yeah, so they should use the local population, help the local population, and use the local population to solve these kind of problems.
No, definitely, and I think that is a challenge in many different projects. That's the real root problems are not considered, and oftentimes those root cause problems can only be perceived by the communities. And if communities are not engaged from the start of a project and not integrated in the planning process, then you can miss those problems entirely until they come up much later on in the project and can have much more negatively impactful consequences for the project and for the communities itself. So absolutely, definitely. Thank you so much, Jacob, for that. Okay, so moving on to Richard. So Richard, same question. In your perspective and from your experience working in Peru and in other countries in South America, what needs to change in tourism to protect people and the environment, and especially those who are living in areas that require significant protection?
I think there are different dimensions to consider this kind of impacts from the community perspective in tourism. One of this is the organization, the social capital that we build or we find in different stages of advance in a community, which means something that is that is obvious, but many times it is not included. It's about the whole community. There's no making a type of participation in the initiative of the business model. A few days when I was in this community, Santa Rosa, it was very nice to have children from the local school coming and understanding and seeing from early age stages, seeing the Melipinelli culture and about some different plants. And I think now about rethinking tourism is understanding that the initiative is not aside from the community in terms of social language, in terms of social inclusion. The International Social Tourism Organization, located also in Canada, has been promoting this for many, many years. After COVID, and now in the post-COVID era, as we are calling it, I think that we are getting more attention to the social aspects about the tourism, which is a different set of strategies and ways that we cannot just make a distortion of the business, but having the business growing as well as the community is having a development. So that would be in terms of community organization, and I'll also including more young people and preventing migration from young people outside their communities, something really interesting. In the other destinations that I was with Nelly, we had a local guide, a local orientator. It was under 25. He got trained in understanding the different types of plants and ecosystem, and the way he approaches visitors out of the knowledge that he has and the feeling and the emotion that he puts into these trails was really, really impactful, at least for myself, seeing a young guy explaining his own territory with such a great love for tourism. And I think that experience can be expanded to different young guys, young women, especially women, rural areas, women faces different problems in every different aspects. And about the product, something that can help tourism protect the areas and have those positive effects is trying to get away from the normal typifications. And for many years, community tourism has been put into the same box. What is the same box? It is about the community tourism only promotes cultural folklore, living culture, and that is not the case. At least in the communities that we are working, the living culture doses that we have in the product, it's minimal. We have a different cultural knowledge about the resources and the relationship that they have with the ecosystems in their protected areas. So going out of the box will be really helpful in next years to have more sustainable products. And last but not least, having the stakeholders understanding these previous two things will help in including not only including the communities in their tables, but also having a collaborative participatory framework in which communities can sustain the model in better conditions.
Great. Thanks so much, Richard. No, you're totally on the mark when it comes to giving the voice to the champions that you identify within the communities. It's them that are going to be the motivating factor for their brothers, sisters, cousins, friends, relationships within the communities, and really championing those champions, really championing those people who have fully embraced the project and see the value in developing a sustainable community tourism in their communities in relation to the protected areas in and around that they live. It's key. It's very key. So yeah, absolutely on the mark there. So thank you very much for that. Okay, so last but not least for this question, and then we'll go on to questions from the participants in this webinar. For Phuong. Phuong, from your perspective and from your experience, what do you think needs to change in tourism to protect people and the environment, especially for those who are living in areas that require significant protection?
Yes, all the previous panelists have come up with really valid points. But from my perspective, working with my communities here in Vietnam, in order to answer the question, probably I would go back. I would go into an example of a situation that we encounter in one of our trainings. So in the health and safety trainings that we provided to our villagers, one of the activities was for them to list out all the risks or health and safety related risks that might happen within the community. And when we went through all of those listed risks, we found out like there are activities from visitors that the villagers or the community don't like at all. And the only way that they can mitigate or eliminate those, let's just say, negative activities or behaviors from visitors is to tell them directly, to tell the visitors directly that they can't perform those acts in the village. So I think then it goes back to the question of what empowerment, community empowerment actually means. And then I linked everything together and I find out people from the local community should be able to feel comfortable in saying no to the visitors when they don't feel comfortable with the activities or whatever that visitors might bring into the village. So I think, of course, there are a lot of different things that need to change, but the facts that we can provide and inform local communities with the knowledge, with the understanding that they are completely entitled to saying no and to creating a code of conduct for visitors to come into the village, because ultimately this is their living environment. This is where their home is, and they should be in charge of, and they should be able to decide who they would like to welcome in their home. So yeah, I think among all of those very needed changes, we need to enforce that and also inform visitors that this is what the good behaviors or a good code of conduct they should follow when they visit the local communities. And so, especially when a project like ours ends, local people can feel comfortable in welcoming guests or in not welcoming guests.
No, totally. Thank you so much, Phuong. I think that's often overlooked when organizations go into communities or want to work with communities, is that the communities live there, it's their place, and therefore their views, their thoughts, their feelings should be considered first and foremost when deciding, or if deciding to implement a project. And I think a lot of people, a lot of organizations overlook the importance of giving communities a voice. And I think it was mentioned several times during this webinar that the community should be able to say no if they don't want tourism, if they don't want activities to be developed in their community. And just because there is funding available to develop a project in a certain community, it doesn't mean that it needs to be developed there if the communities don't want it to be developed there. And I think when planning these initiatives and planning these on the surface well-meaning activities, communities should be first and foremost at the center of any planning process to develop the project. Great. So I think we've gone through the... Go on, Phuong.
Yeah. So for the communities that agree to step in this or take in this initiative of joining community tourism, doesn't mean that they have to say yes to every guest. They have the right to select their own guests, the visitors who they feel like would embrace their culture, will embrace the nature resources, and embrace the hospitality that they offer. So even when they agree to join this initiative, doesn't mean that they can say no later.
Totally. And of course, understanding the negative impacts of tourism is as valid as understanding the positive impacts of tourism. And decisions must be made based on that understanding. Great. So thank you so much to the panelists so far. We've got a few more minutes to go on this webinar. So I'm going to open the floor to questions from our participants. And before I ask the first question, I'd like to encourage participants to ask questions to the panelists. As I said before, feel free, don't be shy. Any question is a valid question. So yeah, please share your questions with us in the chat box. So I'm going to go to the first question. I think that Jim has agreed to answer this question, and maybe I'll ask another panelist as well the same question. So this is a question from Tamara Tembo. So thanks, Tamara, for your question. So Jim, what do you think are the steps to consider when coming up with a community tourism training program?
Well, if people aren't already familiar with it, there is an organization called the Global Sustainable Tourism Council. It was founded by the United Nations World Tourism Organization and also the United Nations Environmental Program and 27 other NGOs. They have standards for destinations, hotels, and tour operators as well, and a training program. An online training program so that it's accessible to anyone, but also local workshops. One of the best, I would say, courses is on destination planning. I put a link into the chat section that provides a window to all the different services that GSTC offers. In addition to that, there are a number of organizations like the Venture Travel Trade Association is a good one and their upcoming summit is all about sustainability, and social inclusion. So I'd encourage you to look at many of these trade organizations. There is one in Africa, also in Asia. We participated in the Mekong Tourism organization and have created training programs as well.
Great, thanks, Jim. That's much appreciated. I'm going to ask the same question just to get a different perspective, an additional perspective, as it were, to this question. So, and I've got some questions for Shivya afterwards. But to Jacob, I'd like to ask you the same question. When you've been working with the communities with the Zara project, what are the steps that you considered when coming up with a training program?
Well, we don't actually have a training program in that sense. So, what do you would like to know specifically?
Okay, well, so when working with communities, have you identified knowledge gaps or skills gaps that are necessary for you to be able to implement the project with the communities? And if so, if not, then great. But if so, what have you done in order to be able to fill those gaps?
Actually, the educational level here is fairly low. So it's you really have to start at the bottom, basic education. Most people here in town, in the village, are illiterate, so it's really getting down to basics. So instead of going to the villagers and asking them what they would identify as a problem, so we can find a solution, is that we ourselves identify the problems that are existing, and offer a solution with them. We talk to them to see if they would approve measures taken by Zara or projects started by Zara. So it's not really coming from them, it's coming from us.
Great. Okay. Thank you so much for that insight, Jacob. So the next question I'm going to ask Shivya. This is from Priyanka Singh. Hi, Priyanka. So the question is, how do you overcome the language and technological barriers during your storytelling sessions? So that's the question. And then there's something from her, our better world experience or any other. So so the first question is, how do you overcome the language and technological barriers when you work with communities to develop your storytelling sessions?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think the most important thing is first to recognize that when we're going into like a training session, it's not necessarily about teaching storytelling, because a lot of cultures have their own forms of storytelling. So whether those are oral storytelling traditions or musical storytelling traditions and so forth, I think it's just recognizing that there are already existing storytellers in those communities, but then figuring out ways on how can we bring them to a digital medium. So we work with local people who can act as translators, but who also understand what the local culture is like. So ideally, someone from the community who has maybe had access to an English education, for example, to be able to do those stories in English. So we have translators, we have transcribers as well. And then we have, we develop storytelling modules such that they can be conducted by community tourism organizations who've already built that trust with the communities. And I think that's something that's really important. And Richard highlighted that earlier as well. So that's really important. And then I think the whole, ultimately, like, you have to be willing to kind of go the extra mile to figure out the logistics, because that's what it really is. Otherwise, it's really easy to make the excuse that, people don't have access to phones, or the technology is not good enough, or, the language is a barrier. But there are easy solutions to all of that. It just takes a little bit more time and effort. But is that worth it? I think it absolutely is, if we want a more equitable world and we want more voices out there.
No, definitely. Thank you so much. And I think you touched on the point there of going the extra mile. And it is always in that extra mile that you actually get things done. And unfortunately, a lot of projects don't go the extra mile and don't take that time because of either time constraints or budget constraints. And so going the extra mile and really taking that extra step, even though it seems a lot more effort, is definitely worthwhile. So thanks so much for that insight.
Thomas,
I have another question here.
Sorry.
Yes. I have another question here from Mike Hemmerly. I'm going to ask Richard this question. So from the discussion so far, and this is from Mike, from the discussions so far, it sounds like the communities generally know best how to safeguard or improve their ecosystem. Is that really the case? And what is the role of outside subject matter experts, either business and conservation, to help local communities improve their lot?
That is one of the good questions, great questions that I was reading in the panel. I like to have the final answer, but I guess I can approach with an answer that I've been seeing in different contexts. In terms of tourism, sustainable tourism is based on the understanding of people within their own ecosystem and the ways they ancestrally or recently have been managing those places. And there are different political institutions, different stakeholders trying to improve upon the previous knowledge that they have about the protection, the conservation, and the responsible use of the resources. What we do in tourism is to interpret and put in a very open way that knowledge, that link, the rural culture, as we call it, to provide a glimpse or a view, a short experience that visitors that came from outside can feel and see of what they do best. But if we expand this question about who knows best, to my mind, is that also we include the considerations that there are some practices, nowadays practices that benefit in a short time economically to the people, even though they're located in a conservation place or a protected area. And that is the challenge, not only the challenge for tourism managers, but also for different stakeholders, specifically attending this problematic situations. And that is the basis of this project. We know that the people manage the territory, but there are certain risks or problems or bad practices that, to be honest, to be realistic, happen inside a protected area. How can we, through tourism, promote a more sustainable way of doing things, a more sustainable approach, and how this economic activity, which is tourism, do not enhance those bad practices, but put an alert at the least, or develop different channels or methodologies and provide different tools. But even though methodology approaches and tools are really important in terms of this ecosystem management, I think the vision and putting discussions of this level, of this deep questions, as I'm seeing here in the panel, is really helpful, because sometimes and many times when it comes to meetings with the stakeholders about what tourism can look like or can be in the future, many times it only reaches about promotion, it only reaches about how many visitors can we have, how much money they will spend in the tourism, in the corridors and roads that we have. But those type of questions, it seems that are left to other stakeholders or to different other times. And I think those type of questions, those type of philosophy, if you allow me, it's really important to identify. And perhaps in that identification of solutions, the answer that I'm providing can be one of them.
Great. Thank you very much, Richard. So I see that there's one more question here in the chat. I'm going to ask Phuong. So Phuong, this is about youth and elders, different generations often experiencing the same environment, but from different perspectives. So the question from Rosie Mercer, thank you, Rosie. Youth and elders often have very different ideas on their community development. How best can these both be accommodated to satisfy everyone?
Well, thank you for your question. It's really interesting when you look at the perspective, like different perspective coming from different generations, and I can go on and on about like the differences. In one of our training, what we do is that first and foremost, we have to admit there will be differences. That's unavoidable. Of course, different people, even from same generation, already have different ideas about what they feel the best for the community. Not to mention people from different generation. So what in one of our as one of the exercises in the whole training is that we sit down with people from different with different ages, and we ask them to kind of list down all the factors that they find, all the differences between the old days and the nowadays, and then they come together, bring all the listed items or listed features together to make sure that even from the same item, or for example, the facilities or infrastructure, or what does that mean, what conservation means for them, or what the a comfortable lifestyle is in each generation. And the fact that when we can sit down with people and there is a mutual agreement that, I look at this culture or this feature from this perspective, from the youngest perspective, and I look at this from an older perspective, then that already solves half of the problem. I'm not saying that they will apply for all the communities, but the fact that people can sit down and agree that there is a difference there is the start of solving the problem. And second of all, the next thing we do is that we identify the let's just say the steering force in the community in taking lead for the community development, because I'm not quite sure how it works in other communities, but in a lot of our communities, the situation is that young people would often go and work in faraway towns, or because they need to make money to make their ends meet. So it means that people who remain are mostly older generation or middle-aged people, and of course with that there comes a kind of confirmation or agreement that those who stay are those who can engage and join the community, the tourism activities more often. So once we can look at it that way, it means that people already agree that the main factors or the forces that should take the lead in community development should be this person, something like that. So, and then the last step would be for them to identify different roles and what people can do, what kind of skills different people from different generation can bring to the table. Of course, with old people, older generation knows the best about their community, history, culture, values that the community can offer to the tourists. And then with technology, marketing, promotion, all of those skills, of course, the younger generation can be so much more advanced. So once you sit down together with the community and define the roles and the steps in community development, then we can assign who will be responsible for what. And it's pretty apparent that each and everyone wants their community to develop. And once we can settle that common ground, everything can be settled.
Thanks, Phuong. And I'd like to ask the same question to Shivya, as I'm sure you've encountered different generations when developing stories with the communities. So I'm just going to reiterate the question quickly. So youth and elders often have very different ideas on their community development. How best can these both be accommodated to satisfy everyone?
Yeah, I think what Phuong shared was very relevant. And, we are seeing very similar things in India, for example, as well, where a lot of younger people are moving out, not just for job opportunities, but also because it's seen as, socially, more acceptable to do that, to move out to bigger cities and look for work there. But I think ultimately it comes down to, what benefits the older people are receiving, but also what opportunities the younger people are receiving. And if you can get both sets of people to the same table, identify skills, identify needs, identify desires, then I think you have, it's a starting point. And I think that conversation can then lead to the directions that you need to go into. So specifically from a storytelling perspective, we have different approaches because, with younger people, there is, we find that, they are a little bit more technologically savvy, for example. So the goal is not just to enable them to tell their stories, but then also to leverage some of this training into the work that they are going to do in the future, whether they're going to be entrepreneurs or do something else in different fields. So this work is still relevant for them. Whereas with the older people, it's really more about, creating this repository of culture and traditional knowledge and wisdom that is kind of wearing away with time, not just in India, but across the world. So the approaches are slightly different in that sense, but they still need to make sense for, different generations and what they aspire to.
Thanks so much, Shivya, for that. Very, very, very insightful. So thank you very much. So we're coming to the end of the webinar. So first and foremost, I'd like to thank all of the panelists for their participation, for the valuable insights that we've all heard during this last hour and 3/4. And for responding to all of the questions candidly and succinctly, and with a lot of insight that comes from experience in the field and working very closely with communities throughout their working life. So thank you very much. And I'd also like to thank all of the participants to this webinar. Thank you for participating, and I really hope that this has been very useful for you. I'm going to finish with just a summary of points that I've picked up from the conversations that we've been having, and then we'll close the webinar by reminding people of the recording that will be shared tomorrow. So the first point that I picked up was that communities should be at the center, must be at the center of strategic planning from the start. That's a fundamental part, and it's often overlooked. The next point that I picked up was listening to communities and respecting their perspectives is key to identifying challenges and finding context relevant solutions. if community perspectives are not taken into consideration from the start, the challenges and issues with the development of community tourism projects will appear later on in the project, and it will be a lot harder to identify the solutions to these. Next, I picked up that championing the champions, or superstars, as Phuong has been calling them, creates a motivating and inspiring environment for the rest of the communities. It's all well and good that people from the outside of communities come and explain their perspectives, but once you have community members who are engaged and are inspired and want to develop community tourism from a community perspective in relation to protected areas. So using tourism as a way to galvanize community members in considering their protected areas around which they live as an important asset to protect, can really, really create this environment that motivates and inspires, and it has this multiplier effect throughout the communities. The next point that I picked up was that thinking about tourism from a community's perspective is equally as important as looking at it from a tourist perspective. It's very important that products are market driven, otherwise you won't get the tourists there. But it's also equally important to consider how communities perceive tourism and how tourism affects communities and how communities experience tourism. And again, it's something that's often overlooked with regards to tourism development in communities, especially around protected areas. I have two more points. One, that it takes time to enable a trusting and purpose-driven environment for successful community-led and driven products to be developed. As Shivya mentioned, going the extra mile, it's usually in that extra mile that the most important and insightful discoveries are made in order for a community-led and driven project to be successful. So never be afraid to take that extra bit of resource and that extra bit of time and effort to engage with communities, to engage with different individuals in order to get that extra perspective that can enable a project to be successful and sustainable. And finally, Jim and all the other panelists have been sharing resources throughout the webinar in the chat, and these will be shared also during the throughout the different platforms that Planeterra posts on. But there are a lot of tools and resources available, mostly free of cost, to support organizations and companies to successfully and sustainably facilitate community-led tourism products around protected areas. So feel free to get in touch with Planeterra, and we will do everything we can to distill these resources in a way that can be accessed by all. So we've come to the end of this webinar. Again, thank you so much for participating. I think I can speak for all the panelists for saying that we're very glad to have shared all of our insights and our experiences with you, and we hope it's been useful. Feel free to ask any questions to Planeterra via the Planeterra email address that will be shared in the chat box. Yeah, that's it. Without further ado, I'd like to bring this webinar to a close. And I don't know whether Selena would like to share some final thoughts or some final information about Planeterra and where you can get more information about the projects that we do.
Thank you, Tom, and thank you to all the panelists and attendees. It's been a wonderful webinar full of knowledge and full of wisdom, and I think it's a great way to celebrate tourism. For more information about Planeterra, you can always visit our website, planeterra.org. We have a lot of resources and blog posts as well that you can learn from. And we've shared the page for our the project we're collaborating with IUCN as well. And feel free to send us a message either through our social media or at info@planeterra.org. Thank you very much for joining us today, and let's celebrate tourism always, not only on World Tourism Day.
Thank you, Selena, for organizing this. Thanks to the panelists. Have a lovely day, rest of your day, evening, night, etc. from around the world.
Yeah, we have joining from different latitudes. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Take care.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you, everyone.